Welcome to Decoding the Conflict Mindset. I'm Dr. Debra Dupree, host and founder of the DCM podcast. This podcast arose out of ongoing experience with people confused about conflict, fearful, not knowing what to do, and particularly in our work world, but also in our communities. And so my goal in hosting this podcast is to bring to you thought leaders from throughout the world of business, from the world of lawyering, from the world of mediation, whatever that might be, to give you insight as to how to deal with people in conflict. So today I am absolutely delighted to have with me Kevin Robertson. Kevin is, like me, a licensed therapist, but also a certified employee assistance professional. Over 20 years of behavioral health experience. And so I'm delighted to have him here today because we're going to dive into the toxic bad boss, as well as the upcoming California Senate Bill 553, soon to go into effect as of June 1st. In the last 15 years, Kevin has directly supported organizations, employees, and their family members through behavioral health and employee assistance. He transitioned to Briotix Health in the late 2021 to oversee the accommodation consulting aspects of returning employees to work following the development of medical conditions. Place true to my heart because that's what I do too. Kevin is rich with experience. He talks about the green flags and taking note of what we do well. He also talks about the yellow flags and what does that mean? And of course, we know what red flags mean. Warning signs of danger, danger. And we tie this together to take a look at some of the dynamics about workplace behavior when it does come to toxic bosses and bullying. He also talks about some of the longitudinal effects that children, we as children moving into our adulthood, may actually carry with us, and how programs like employee assistance and the services Briotix provide can help redirect that. And we'll also touch on the opportunities that both of us think SB 553 has for you and me and your organization. Workplace Violence Prevention Plan. So stay tuned. Don't go away. We'll be starting up in just a few minutes. Again, I'm delighted to have Kevin with me. Grab your coworkers, colleagues, bosses, those people who you feel should really hear this, but also pass it on to your families because he brings a lot to the table. So again, don't go away. We'll be starting soon. Welcome to Decoding the Conflict Mindset podcast. We air twice per month, and this time I'm so excited to have with us Kevin Robertson. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Great. Well, great. I know, Kevin, I just explained a little bit about your background and some of the things that you've done, and I'm excited to have you here because we both share that mental health background. Gone a little bit different directions. You've really gone in the EAP arena, and I'd like to have you talk about that while I come in from more of the mediation. But I'll tell you right now, Kevin, I want to talk a little bit about those toxic bad bosses that our employers are dealing with and why they're fed up. So, but before we go there, I want to hear a little bit about how did you sort of navigate through your career and how did you end up with Briotix?
Yeah, probably, my background and foundation is in marriage and family counseling. So obviously a lot of communication. My internships way back when, right in that past life, certainly started with marriage counseling and really looking at some of those issues and conflicts within the family setting. And then also kind of simultaneously, we were looking at violence prevention in school districts. So really taking some of those communication styles and implementing them in the school districts and figuring out different ways to not only prevent, but treat some of those behaviors in the school systems, so that as they transitioned into adulthood and transitioned into the workforce, that a lot of those behaviors wouldn't follow. And that kind of led me into more of the transitional age youth, working with the foster care and mental health systems, in a number of different county and nonprofit organizations, which again, taking a lot of those individuals that have had, very traumatic or very, difficult childhoods and helping them with vocational training and vocational skills to be able to manage in the workplace. which was kind of interesting as I then, grew up and got out of my internship and transitioned to, the private sector and the employee assistance program world. And there, it was really interesting to be able to see, a lot of those individuals that I had worked with in the school districts, a lot of those individuals that we had, worked with, through vocational training and whatnot, were in the workforce. Obviously, I didn't have the pleasure of working with anybody specific, but seeing those trends and some of those behaviors that probably needed to be addressed early on, and how that translated to, a psychologically safe workplace and how that carried over. For example, were the bullies now bullying in the workplace? Were there those who were bullied in schools and in different programs in their youth now, displaying similar behaviors or learned behaviors, as in bullying and whatnot? So it's been quite a journey from that perspective. My kind of journey to Briotix was really kind of organic. Briotix is a prevention and return to work program and an organization, and we really take a preventative approach. So to have the opportunity to come and look at it from a behavioral health perspective and help integrate a lot of the skills and a lot of the needs from a prevention standpoint that we see in the workplace, but also from a return to work and a stay at work programming. It's been quite a journey, and really looking forward to see where we continue to grow with it.
Well, that's exciting because as you know, we've talked before that I actually had an early start with Briotix even before it was called Briotix. And so I've seen the growth and the development. It's just been fascinating how it's grown out of Southern California to be something nationwide. And that's just really exciting. Kevin, I do want to say, I think there may be a lot of people who may not necessarily be as familiar with things like employee assistance programs, return to work programs, and things like that. So I'd like to ask you to amplify on that a little bit.
Sure. So a lot of employers want to provide their employees with a resource. And an employee assistance program is one of those resources that the employer can obviously offer. There's different levels and different tiers of services, but ultimately, the employee assistance program is really designed to assist with the psychosocial barriers to the workplace. Perhaps an employee is going through a divorce and needs legal or financial support or childcare resources. The EAP should be able to help out with that and provide those resources. It really was designed several years ago around substance abuse. If someone was having a substance abuse issue, for example, in the workplace, it was a safe place to refer the employee to get help. That obviously has, again, organically transformed over several years. And again, depending on what level of service an EAP offers, there may be 6 free sessions with a counselor. And the EAP would go ahead and identify who that counselor is, and in some circumstances, even assist with scheduling. So again, it's really about removing the psychosocial barriers to the workplace and for that individual to be able to really operate in the workplace seamlessly. So for example, that's one of the EAPs, that was the approach we always took. They also offer typically a lot of managerial services as well. They'll do on-site trainings on a number of topics. One area that I kind of definitely tried to put a lot of attention into and hopefully excelled was around some of the violence prevention and threat management, to where managers or organizations could call the EAP and get consultation around potentially active threats, or workplace violence, those types of things. As we know, when we talk about workplace violence in particular, there's different forms. There may be criminal intent. There may be worker on worker or personal relationship or customer client, violence potentially as well. So our goal was really to assist that organization in managing all of those potential threats and making sure that ultimately the employees were safe, as well as the organization was taking care of everything that they needed to take care of from a risk mitigation perspective as well.
Okay, and so that sounds to me that that's some of the preventative kinds of things that you're trying to do then, is get on top of it before it truly escalates into something that may be much more injurious or devastating or, life-ending, shall we say.
Yeah, absolutely. There's also kind of the aftermath of it as well, where we would also set up critical incident debriefings, or kind of a trauma-informed response to those involved in the workplace situation. So that was something, again, where we could either do it virtually or at some point also have a provider go out on site and facilitate a process around a trauma-informed kind of either group setting or individual. Some programs also offer case management, but certainly that's more of kind of a reactive approach to the situation.
Yeah, I've certainly been part of that too, having affiliated with a number of EAPs over the years. At Briotix, then, you mentioned the return to work, and I would like to have a particular emphasis, Kevin, not just on, when somebody's had a physical injury or a medical condition, but also what happens when employees, face the trauma. We now define trauma very differently than we used to a few years ago. But let's say somebody does have difficulty with a bully or a difficult boss. And, we're hearing a lot more about toxicity in the workplace these days. How would Briotix or EAP, how would you step into that? What's the prevalence from your perspective, your experience around that bad bossing, shall we say?
Mm-hmm. I think that a lot of times, and I'll speak from a Briotix perspective, we have providers across the nation providing on-site services. These providers are typically occupational therapists, athletic trainers. It's our industrial sports medicine program. And we have the luxury of being a vendor that is actually there on-site. And most of our prevention services are around musculoskeletal injury and injury prevention. So being there, we have quite an interesting opportunity, and there's an interesting dynamic where we're meeting with employees, we're not their employer, and we hear all kinds of different things. So typically, if there's an issue with a coworker, or if there's a difficult situation with, their supervisor or manager, a lot of times we're hearing about that. Sometimes it's in the form of gossip, sometimes it's in the form of a complaint. But I think it's really important for that employee to be heard. And we start there. And I think it's about hearing that employee, validating what they may be experiencing, and then providing a resource. In many cases, that resource could be an employee assistance program, so that they could maybe talk to someone. It may be human resources. But basically, we want to make sure that that employee doesn't feel like they're all alone. And so we want to be able to provide that resource. Our providers go through a training specifically around employee engagement. And what we want to do is teach them some skills around active listening, but we also want to have our providers assist with leveraging the existing benefits that those employers already have, like an EAP. So, for example, if that employee is really struggling with communicating with their manager, then that is something that we want them to get assistance with. And we can certainly, offer that phone number. Is that a phone call we can make with the employer? How can we assist that employee get to the appropriate resource at the right time? And so that's kind of the stance that we've taken. Again, we work with some employers with a robust benefit offering where they have a full service EAP. And we work with some employers that don't have an EAP at all. So, that's where some of our internal resources, we may do some coaching with that provider. We may provide some communication, fact sheets, some simple exercises. Maybe they're over anxious in the workplace when they, are about to have an interaction with their manager. And there's some grounding techniques or some relaxation techniques that we can offer. So we really want to look at a whole health model and really approach wellness from a holistic perspective, meaning we recognize the connection between mind and body. And for us to treat that as a disconnect or treat them as separate entities, I think we're missing the boat. And unfortunately, I think, there's a lot of service models that don't look at the employee as a holistic being, and we assume that if there's a physical injury, that we treat the physical injury and everything's going to be okay. But the reality is, we know that there's all kinds of different comorbidities. If there's a cardiac incident or a back injury, we know that there's high prevalence, in connection with depression and anxiety. So for us to assume that we're just going to stick that employee right back to that same old workplace without putting some safeguards in place, again, I think could be potentially be setting up that employee for failure, and or setting up a workplace that may not be equipped to manage some of those behaviors.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, you said a couple of words that just rang in my head. Psychological safety. That's something I've been talking about for a long, long time. And I know, I appreciate you bringing up the mind-body connection, because as I oftentimes will tell people, it's real and alive. I know over my many years of experience, particularly being a mediator, where conflicts have just gone too far, and appropriate interventions were not provided, that I have truly seen people become physically ill because of the stress and the anxiety and depression. I've met people who their hair has started falling out. They've got gastrointestinal problems now. They've developed some kind of heart condition. But it all emanates, at least in the mediations I do, it emanates back to a poor relationship that wasn't managed, wasn't kept in check, and sort of spun out of control. And so. Again, I find that a lot of people, and why I have this podcast, is that when we face conflict, we're oftentimes very fearful. And fearful is a stress response, and it's an emotional response, and it starts working its way through our bodies. And so a lot of the things you talked about, like mindfulness and relaxation and breathing and all of those kinds of things, are great ways, simple ways to redirect what's going on for someone. But it's getting over the fear of reaching out. It's not that you're mentally crazy. It's just that these are real physiological, biological responses to what we perceive as fear and conflict. So, yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think that there's a huge piece, that the stigma around mental health is obviously still very real. And I think that that's impacting a lot of workplaces, and how that kind of translates. And you mentioned the word fear, right? Is an employer fearful or reluctant to have a difficult conversation, or just broach the topic that, hey, I'm worried about you. Things have not been the same, right? I'm starting to see some of those yellow flags pop up. And I think it's important that we talk about them before they become red flags. But again, I think it goes back to, what are we doing on the front end from a prevention perspective? Are we equipping our managers to have that difficult discussion on a difficult topic? And I think that that's where, I think traditionally, there's been kind of a lapse in how we're approaching different trainings and different preparations as we put managers in places of power. And are they able to have those difficult conversations in a supportive way? Or are we aligning them and giving them the tools to be purely reactive?
Mm-hmm. That is two really critical elements, I think, because I know that's one of the things I try to bring to light, particularly when I'm working with higher level professionals, attorneys, mediators, is that there are actually a lot of clues if we know what we're looking for. And I know earlier in my mediation days how oftentimes supervisors and managers would say, well, they didn't say that bothered them. They didn't say that they were hurt by what was said, and it's like, duh, it's like,
Right.
I just look at it, and then a change in behavior, withdrawal, so oftentimes a drop in performance, attendance becomes problematic. There's all kinds of clues. And that's where, trying to be aware of those clues to step in earlier, but then also how do you frame the conversation becomes critically important.
Yeah, absolutely.
You said a couple of things, Kevin, and you talked about yellow flags and red flags, and let's go back to the green flags, and describe a little bit more about, what do we do with green flags? What do we do with yellow flags? And then what do we do with red flags? And say more about that, because we know we have SB 553 around the corner on July 1st, Workplace Violence Prevention Plan. And so I want to tap into that before we close, but talk more about the flags, and because this is going to be, I think, critical information for employers and employees to know as we move into this next phase of workplace management.
Right. Yeah, the flags I kind of base in investment in human capital, right? Our employees are our biggest investment as employers, and the question is what are we doing to ultimately protect our investment? We can talk about business 101 all day, right? But the reality is, what are we doing? Mm-hmm. So when I talk about green flags, that's when everything is smooth. That's when everything is going great, right? There are no performance issues. Everyone's showing up every day to work. That's when we really have a captive audience to do some of, I think, the front end work, to be able to assist an employee better manage, become more resilient, be able to have and develop coping strategies for workplace change or workplace adversity. And so that when we start to see some of those yellow flags pop up, we have kind of an understanding, and we also have a basis to engage that employee in a conversation about what was going well during the green flag times, what we may have learned in the green flag times. For example, I'm a big proponent of organizational resilience, right? And if we're trying to teach someone an organization and their employees skills around resilience when there are yellow and red flags coming up, we're too late. We're too late in the process. So I really like to figure out different ways and to think outside the box. How do we address emotional intelligence? How do we address stress management, conflict resolution, resiliency when the flags are green, when there are no concerns, when we have a captive audience, when we're able to take that in and really understand what we're learning, and we're not on the verge or in active crisis. And for some people, active crisis may look a lot different, may be triggered by different things, but certainly, again, we're putting band-aids on things if the flags are not green at that point. Mm-hmm. Then we have the yellow flags, right? Those are your typical warning signs, right? The employee starting to call out a lot. There may be some performance issues. There may be some mood swings, right? These are some things that certainly, Kevin's not himself lately. They're kind of those yellow flags. And typically, are the conversations happening at that time? And what I mean by the conversations happening, it's about going, hey, you don't seem to be yourself, Kevin. I'm wondering what's going on for you, and if there's anything I can do to support you. Now, we haven't crossed any lines. There's no legalities there, right? But simply showing concern as a manager to an employee that spends over 2,000 hours a year in this workplace, right? So for us to think that, that the workplace shouldn't be involved is problematic. But I think what we've seen is when those yellow flags start to come up, we fall back on our benefits, right? My organization provides this amazing, robust package of benefits that includes, a mindfulness app, and it includes behavioral health support, and it has an EAP with 6 free sessions. We also offer leave of absence and all of these different pieces of the puzzle that we feel support our employee. But when we think about it, right, I'm spending 2,000 hours a year with my work family, right, and my work group, who can be a tremendous amount of social support, but all of those interventions are isolative, right? Go out and talk to a therapist. At your lunch break, use your phone to access the app. Go out on a leave of absence. Those are all things that realistically kind of get rid of the problem from a workplace perspective. But what are we doing to really foster that employee's ability to maintain, to stay in the workplace, to be productive, but also to address some of those issues? So I think that, when the yellow flags come up, we as kind of I hate to put everybody under the umbrella, because I think there's probably a lot of employers, and I know that there are definitely some employees that do a really good job when we're in the yellow flag phase of addressing those employees and helping them. But what have we done when the flags were green? Do we have anything to go back to? Do we have anything to engage them on? Wouldn't it be great to be able to say, Kevin, I know there's a lot going on at work, and there's certainly been some major changes here in the workplace. I'm wondering if we can go back to last year's resiliency training and talk a little bit about some of those skills, and wondering if we can pull some of those in, and would they be helpful, and can we implement some of those skills now that times are rough. And then I have the red flags. That's obviously when we're in full-blown crisis mode, and where we should be looking at more probably of a proactive and a reactive approach to what needs to happen. If we want to talk about workplace violence, that's when we might see some, a verbal altercation or verbal conflict in the workplace. I think that's much more of a kind of a red flag from an aggression perspective. Obviously, any sort of violence, we want to be able to be very reactive to it and have policies in place around that. But certainly, again, the more work we're able to do on the front end, the better.
Yeah, again, you raised a lot of really important points, and it makes me, think too, is that I know for, in the work where I go in, and not just mediation, but more organizational intervention, I ask questions about, well, what are the sources of conflict? How do people see this? Because if one person's, impacted by something, could be more. It's not just an isolated individual, but it could be really indicative or a symptom of a broader workplace culture. Another thing, not only to look at sources of conflict, are the intensity of conflict. And unfortunately, I've just seen so many organizations wait way too long, that the relationship is so damaged that trying to help people get back to a working relationship again is just like, too late. Not enough, where were you, several months ago? And that's oftentimes where we'll see one or both parties actually leave, because they don't want to work for the employer anymore either, because the employer didn't have their back, the employer didn't do enough early enough. And then with that too, is that, like you said, the yellow flags, the green flags are really the areas to say, okay, well, what is going on? And what can we do to bring, like you said, build your resiliency, bring that resiliency back into our dynamics here. And I like to say, how do we have conversations, not confrontations? Because too often they erupt into that confrontation, and then things escalate. So that takes me then to, this new bill. I'm sure many people may or may not be aware of SB 553 that Governor Newsom passed here in California to take effect July 1st. I know you and I've talked, and I'm pretty excited. It's got a long way to go, but at least it's a start, So tell us a little bit more about your impressions about 553.
You hit it on the head. I think it's an amazing start. And I think that some of the newer requirements that are identified in it, I think are really good, because the part of the bill really creates a robust reporting requirement. And so, it's not just filling out a few fields in a form anymore. It really is robust, and it's going to be very time consuming. And I think for me, I think it's going to shed light on the need for a proactive approach, especially when they start to see how much manpower it takes when we start to get into the gray area on some of this. So I think from a logistic perspective, I think it's going to be hopefully really good to, again, shed some light on a very, very important topic. I think the second part that I'm really excited about really is around the bill, including identifying hazards to the employee's role specifically. So it really, I think, is going to promote a lot of thought around process of risk and prevention. So, for example, if you're interacting with the public, let's talk about that. What are the risks with that specific role? There's not only risks with coworkers, but also with customers or clients. And so I think, again, it promotes a deeper level of thinking about some of these roles or some of these positions. Some of the things that we do, for example, at Briotix, we do cognitive or psychological demands. And we assist the employers identify those, and we're putting them into those job analysis demands. And so with that, we are able to take a peek at what psychological demands may be needed for a specific role. And I think that that's extremely valuable, extremely valuable when we're talking about injury prevention or emotional injury prevention. It's also extremely important when we're talking about returning an employee to work as well. And so I think that it helps the employer realize the emphasis that needs to be put on these demands that do impact hazards, do impact safety, not just of the specific employee, but the workplace in general.
Great. Yeah. I think we both used the word exciting. We've just got a couple more months left to go. And I think back to 1993 when they rolled out the Injury Illness Prevention Plan, and everybody going, oh my gosh. But, in reality, it did lead to a lot of those preventative things in terms of how to improve workplace physical safety. And unfortunately, that's why I see a 553 as really being an opportunity to finally tackle psychological safety. Because when we take a look at complaints before the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and this ties into my notions about bad bossing or toxic bossing. I think it's 53% of all complaints before the EEOC is around retaliation. That means employees feel that their supervisors, their managers, their bosses are retaliating against them. And that's a whole psychological conversation we're not going to have today, but what is that? And then the second highest complaint before the EEOC is disability, nearly 50%. And so we're seeing an increase in that, particularly around mental health issues. And again, 553, I see as potentially paving the way of finally getting on top of things from an employer perspective as far as how do we address this? Like you said, we spend over 2,000 hours working for our employers. And we've heard a lot about the quiet resignation and what drives that. And the things that I've been reading is a lot around unfair treatment at work. And so we've got a lot to go, baby.
We do.
Yeah. So Kevin, I want to ask you if people would like to reach out to you and learn more about what Briotix has to offer and maybe talk to you about what you can do in their organizations. How can they reach you?
Yeah, so I can be reached. Email is probably the most effective way to get a hold of me. And that's going to be kevin.robertson@briotix.com. That's going to be your best route to go. And, certainly we can chat a little bit about where we've come, what we do specifically, and how we can best support the employers out there, and not only with preventative services, but also a return to work as well. We have all kinds of different things from, job coaching to accommodations, consulting to graduated return to work. So, we really want to put an emphasis on making sure that the workplace is not only physically, but emotionally safe as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kevin, for being here. And you've helped shed light on a lot of things that I deal with, but it's so helpful to have somebody else who specializes in a different kind of way too. So for our viewers and listeners, I want you to think, what kinds of, yellow flags are you seeing in your workplace? What red flags are already there? Time to act and get on top of it before things escalate to violence. So let's pay attention to these things, and let's get over our own fear about addressing things that we may not feel comfortable with. Get skills, get help, it's out there. And so thank you again for being with me today with Kevin Robertson from Briotix, all about workplace safety, emotional as well as physical. Thank you, Kevin.
Great, thank you.
Dr. Debra Dupree, the Mindset Doc. If you like what you heard, please pass it on, share it with your friends, your bosses, and your employers. Coming up next, we'll have another great speaker continuing our dialogue about female leaders. So come on back. Let us know what you liked about this particular program. Leave some comments in the chat box below. Like it. See you soon. Well, I hope that you gained some insight from Kevin Robertson as we talk about the changing face of today's workplace. We've struggled with workplace violence for a long time, and now we see California starting to do some different things coming June 1st. And so gain some insight, share with your leaders what's happening, what's coming ahead. Now, we're going to shift gears, and talk to Beverly Glazer. Beverly is a psychotherapist like myself, also an internationally certified addiction specialist, as well as coach and founder of Reinvent Impossible Inc. What Beverly has done over her years of practice and insights is to really focus on the female leader over 50. Today's females face many challenges and wear many hats. And Beverly has exceptional insight and expertise in helping support women over 50. And so please stay tuned. Pass this on to all the women that you know in the world, as well as their male counterparts, to learn what we can gain from Beverly about the unique role and insight perspective from our female leaders. Dr. Debra Dupree, the Mindset Doc, thank you for being part of the Decoding Conflict Mindset, out to make a difference in how people think about conflict, transforming confrontations into conversations.